Hello, and welcome to Operation Opposition, a podcast addressing topics the mainstream media often ignores while promoting topics to encourage free thought. I am your host, Katrin, an anti-human trafficking advocate, and I couldn't be more thrilled that you're here. As for most of our episodes, I am issuing a parental advisory. The topics discussed on Operation Opposition are not intended for children. Social media is in an uproar regarding the Department of Justice's recent release of 3 million files tied to the infamous pedophile and human trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Many of you may recall in January of 2024, 950 pages of court documents were unsealed. 2 years later, congressional representatives Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna sponsored the Epstein Files Transparency Act, in which the execution we are partly seeing today. I use the word partially here because the Department of Justice has not released all files as required, and admittedly have largely been kicking and protesting their way throughout this process. And in case you're wondering, besides the infamous right-hand woman of Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, there is yet to be a single arrest of any other Epstein associates and clients. This release has been more sensational than in times past. This is due to many notable figures, such as current FBI Director Kash Patel lying under oath in a congressional hearing. Kash Patel falsely claimed that no evidence exists of Epstein trafficking minors. The new release of the Epstein files, as they have come to be called, is a whopping 3 million document cache that contradicts the director's claims. Furthermore, other notable figures that either denied and or urged the general public to quote-unquote move on from Epstein's and his associates' heinous crimes were Ben Shapiro, who also falsely claimed that there was no evidence that Epstein had ties to Israel. Obviously, Attorney General Pam Bondi went from claiming she had the files on her desk to denying their existence within a matter of months. All of this information is publicly accessible by doing a quick Google search, in case any of you were wondering. So besides the sheer amount of documents, what else makes this release different from the previous ones? The initial release contained information most of the public already knew. Epstein had a plane called the Lolita Express, his own private island in the Caribbean, a New York residence, and the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, as well as a flight log containing a plethora of celebrities and politicians who were already known to have been associated with him on some level. This release, however, directly implicates that Epstein was an agent of Mossad and had US government backing from the CIA, as well as politicians in Congress and the presidency. There are a whole host of other names mentioned, and we'll get into those in a few minutes. However, I also want to throw a disclaimer in here. Just because a name may be mentioned in Epstein's emails does not necessarily mean they were directly associated with him, knew the extent of his crimes, and or ever visited one of his properties. I am not saying these names aren't necessarily worth investigating. However, a trend I've noticed is that a lot of people are throwing around names simply because they were mentioned once or twice and accusing them of being literal pedophiles. Now, obviously, on the flip side of that, there are people who are mentioned within the emails and or other documents that are pedophiles, and usually who appear a plethora of times. That being said, before we really dive in, I want to say a few things. 1, this episode is going to contain disturbing information in as much detail as the evidence allows. This means I will not be censoring much, and I will describe said events as they happened with the evidence presented. Please take breaks as needed, as this episode will be heavy. 2nd, as always, I encourage all listeners to do their due diligence and research. If something seems unbelievable, please read the Epstein files yourselves, as it is not my job to be your ultimate source of information. That is for you to decide. Thirdly, my intention here is to promote free thinking and discuss ways in which the mainstream media has failed the survivors, which will be discussed in the latter half of the episode. I will not only be reading directly from the Epstein files, I will also be mentioning other sources as well, such as emails and various media sources. Furthermore, my intention is to not leave you feeling hopeless, confused, lost, and discombobulated. That is why towards the end of this episode, I will be spotlighting organizations and individuals who are actively involved in anti-human trafficking initiatives. I believe to truly make a difference, reading the Epstein files only goes so far. There is nothing you or I can do at this point, as much as we'd like to change what happened. The only power the past holds is to learn from it, execute justice, and move on. My father pointed out that attempting to read all of the Epstein files single-handedly bears little fruit, and that is correct. Based on the research I have already done, and I have read hundreds of those files within the order they have been presented on the website, many of them are repetitive and seemingly unimportant for an average civilian such as myself. However, there are still some files that are worth reading. The reason I say this is because we have been lied to from nearly all public fronts, from the government and their various agencies, to the media, to prominent public figures, even within academia. The bottom line here, grim as it is to admit, is that trafficking happens everywhere, even in places we are taught are safe. Last thing, many files released have redacted information. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, the Department of Justice has not released all files as requested. This likely means that the information in the other thousands of files is darker than the ones we currently have. As heartbreaking and sickening as that is to admit, it is the most logical conclusion. I also want anyone who may be skeptical that the events that transpired are real to know that they are very much real. There are also many redacted and unredacted photos available on the Department of Justice's website proving Epstein's international connections. Let's get in. You can access the Epstein files online via the Department of Justice's website. I will be linking this in the show notes. Epstein was first charged in Florida with multiple charges of unlawful sex with a minor, as well as solicitation of prostitution in 2006. However, at this time, Epstein was found guilty by a grand jury of only the solicitation of prostitution, and the other charges were dropped. He was then convicted via plea bargain in 2008 of this crime. He was sentenced to 18 months in the Palm Beach County Jail. For those of you wondering, the reoffending rates of pedophilia-related offenders is quite high. A study conducted by the National Library of Medicine found that over 40% of convicts who were convicted of pedophilia, mainly in regards to child molestation, reoffend within their lifetime. A different study conducted by the Washington State Institute for Public Policy found that exhibitionists, meaning that those who expose their genitalia to minors, have the highest reoffend rate from 41 to 71%. Child molesters fell within the 40% category, and rapists from 7% to 35%. Most convicts are likely to reoffend within less than 20 years of their conviction, which, unfortunately, is hardly surprising. Such as in Epstein's case, his 2008 conviction did not stop him from raping children amongst other crimes he committed. One of the files, titled EFTA 00005711 and reported in 2011, reads the following. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, Miami Field Office, is assisting the Palm Beach Police Department in Florida with an ongoing investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, a U.S. citizen. Along with associates, Epstein is believed to have manipulated underage girls from local high schools to perform massages and sexual acts at his residence. The victims were usually recruited by other underage females, and after performing various acts were paid sums of money in the $200 to $1,000 range. Investigation in Miami identified a victim named Blank, married, name born as a U.S. citizen, and the victim of a sex crime. She is not considered a subject, nor is she facing charges in the investigation described below. FBI Miami believes Blank was working at a local resort when she was approached to meet Epstein at his residence, agreed, and soon began traveling with Epstein to various locations outside the state of Florida. Several witnesses have corroborated travel with Epstein. FBI Miami also has evidence Epstein paid and provided her an apartment in exchange for sex. In addition to the accounts of travel, FBI Miami has obtained a witness statement from one of Epstein's victims. This victim, who was 14 at the time of the incident, observed Epstein to have had sexual intercourse with another girl who was 17 at the time. Epstein later indicated to his victim that was in and had started a family of her own. In 2008, FBI Miami conducted an investigation which determined that they were residing in Australia. Accordingly, FBI Miami coordinated with the FBI Legal Attaché Office in Canberra for a letter to be delivered to notifying her she was a victim of a crime. I also apologize if there is poor grammar. I am quite literally reading verbatim. In West Palm Beach, Florida, and expressed her willingness to speak further with investigators about her activities with Epstein. In further conversations with the USAO, indicated Epstein had instructed her to have sex with numerous associates in the United States and overseas. Identified several subjects by name and indicated she had records to support her allegations. Further advised she could identify several other women that were underage and had engaged in sexual situations with Epstein. Finally, personnel to the U.S. Consulate in Sydney, Australia, on Thursday, 17th March 2011, to be interviewed in detail and to provide copies of the records she possesses regarding the above investigation. To currently reside at blank, email contacted the United States Attorney's Office, end quote. Among the files lies an acronym known as CSAM, which stands for Child Sexual Abuse Material. These files have been redacted. However, other excerpts which point to the heinous crime can be found. According to file EFTA 00006107, and I quote, complainant stated that she is a professional artist and took pictures of her sisters 12 and 16 years for her own personal artwork. Epstein stole the photos and negatives and is believed to have had sold the pictures to potential buyers. Epstein at one time requested blank to take pictures of young girls at swimming pools. Epstein is now threatening blank that if she tells anyone about the photos, he will burn her house down, end quote. It is unclear who this photographer is and their direct connection and history with Epstein. And based on this context, the photographer themselves seems to also be guilty. Another document, EFTA 00007087, reads the following. In 2001, age 14, was recruited by another female to provide Hayes Epstein with a personal massage. The first time that blank brought to Epstein's home at 358 El Brillo Way, Palm Beach, Florida, and Epstein was in front. She was 17 years old at the time. First contact with Epstein at the age of 15 was for the purpose of providing him with personal massages. Estimates that she returned to Epstein's home approximately 100 times between 2001 and 2003. Epstein in presence during all but 3 of the massages she provided. During additional visits, Epstein tried to engage in more and more sexual behavior. On one occasion, Epstein introduced an unidentified female who at the end of each massage was paid $200 to $400 by Epstein. On one occasion, when blank, she was approximately 16 years old, Epstein's assistant telephoned MEI and told her that Epstein wanted to photograph her. She traveled to Epstein's Palm Beach home, where they took a series of nude photographs of posing at several locations on Epstein's property. Was also paid $500 for posing nude for the photographs. Reported that he used a digital camera to take the nude photographs. This information further leads me to the belief that the computers that are the subject of the grand jury are likely to contain evidence of Jeffrey Epstein's solicitation of minors to engage in prostitution and may contain child pornography, end quote. Other files include images of videotape recordings and some of the titles. One, EFTA 00008018, describes the image as a Victoria's Secret bra. The reason I bring this up is because Epstein was associated with former Victoria's Secret CEO Les Wexner, who was one of the first millionaires to hire Epstein as his money manager in the late 1980s. The two had a close relationship spanning decades. Other files include excerpts from the book Massage for Dummies, as well as another excerpt in which the chapter title is called Baby Massage reads the following. Regardless of how you feel about strangers touching your child's feet in supermarkets, this story does point to the widespread acceptance of baby massage and child massage by people everywhere. End quote. Another document, EFTA 000-40553, reads the following. Said she recalled Mr. Epstein as kind and casual, wearing sweatpants, pouring champagne, and talking about her college plans. During the trip, they all went to see a movie. As the film progressed, Mr. Epstein began rubbing his bleep hand and then her lower leg, she said. End quote. File EFTA 000-40577 also reads the following. Back in the 90s, Ghislaine Maxwell recruited a girl for a modeling career. Instead of modeling, she was sold as a slave for sex and torture. Prince Andrew was an accessory to her death as he tortured her and me to force her murder. I need to get a passport to identify her. I will need someone to contact the passport office to get an expedited passport. End quote. This email was sent in 2020. Other disturbing emails read from figures and the media, to my knowledge, have refused to name, and thus I will list them. Irene D. Rothschild was mentioned 4,504 times and had direct email correspondence with Epstein related to travels, visitations, and speaking over the phone. Based on the files, we are unsure of what the phone calls and other correspondence they may have said. It is confirmed they met multiple times in person and had dinner together at Irene D. Rothschild's home in Petty's. One of the emails between Rothschild and Jeffrey reads the following. Thank you much. No problem. I'll take care of NYU and Brown. End quote. For context, both Epstein and Rothschild had connections at both private and public universities. Speaking of universities, one of Epstein's connections was Robert Trivers, an American evolutionary biologist who graduated from Harvard University. Trivers has been mentioned 585 times in the files, and I will be reading some of his emails as follows. Miss chatting with you. Am back at work. We'll give keynote to the Louisiana State Psychological Association in early November, and next day meet with department heads and deans for 3 universities, Tulane, New Orleans, Louisiana State, to see if school deal can be worked out. Then off to U Texas at Austin and Texas A&M, to which I have never been. Biology is very strong in genetics, and they may be interested. I will lecture advances in human evolutionary genetics, a specialty of mine. I attach latest version of Honor Killing. Key is to look at are the photos. The women are almost without fail beautiful. End quote. In this same email, Trivers also admits, albeit jokingly, to being perverse. His words, not mine. Other emails with Trivers explain that Trivers will give a lecture on honor killings and murders, where he quotes, through the roof here, end quote. Within these files are also some unredacted photos of literal children being tied up, molested, and abused. I will not explain these in detail out of respect for the victims. Harvard was mentioned 12,159 times. Arizona State University was mentioned 3,491 times. Brown University was mentioned 92 times. Many major educational institutions have been infiltrated. We shall now move on to another subject. One of Jeffrey Epstein's assistants is Leslie Groff. She worked for Epstein for a handful of years, and victims explained that she helped facilitate trafficking operations and travel. As one of his correspondents, Leslie Groff has been mentioned 163,328 times. For those of you wondering, former President Bill Clinton is currently recorded in the unredacted files to have ridden on Epstein's plane 32 times. He is mentioned 1,602 times. President Trump is also mentioned. However, we do not currently have records of him riding on Epstein's plane, visiting the island, and other properties of Epstein, to my knowledge. President Trump is mentioned 1,750 times. I have read dozens of emails in which President Trump was mentioned, and it seemed that he and Epstein had some bad blood. I do not say this as an avid supporter of President Trump. I say this because the current evidence we have does not directly indict him as it does others. That being said, We do have photos of President Trump with Epstein on a few occasions. I am unsure as to the extent of their relationship. However, anyone directly affiliated with Epstein understandably arouses suspicion. Richard Branson was mentioned 674 times and did meet with Jeffrey personally on a handful of occasions. Bill Gates was mentioned 2,618 times. Other searches have diminished, with the DOJ removing these files from the public. I am unsure how many times Ghislaine was mentioned, amongst other notable pedophiles. I can confirm there are disturbing images of Epstein with young children, and thus any claim in which Epstein only trafficked young adults is false. Other crimes in which from the files are true include cannibalism, kidnapping, murder, and occult ritual sacrifices. I honestly do not feel like going into detail here. The victims, most of whom were underage, do not deserve to have the crimes rehashed in detail, especially without their consent. The research I have done regarding the content of the files has led me to several conclusions. Your enemies believe that Jesus is real. There are images in which Epstein has mocked Jesus and Christianity as a whole. Christians, take note. You have strong, incredibly influential, and powerful enemies, but never lose sight of the fact that Jesus is so much stronger. Conspiracy theorists, you have by and large been correct. There is in fact a shadowy, satanic cabal who runs most of the world. Trust your intuition, no pattern recognition, and keep digging. There are heartbreakingly many figures and organizations who are paid off and/or who have been killed for knowing the truth. Lastly, I understand what the implications of what I am going to say are. It is also true, based on the files, that most of Epstein's circle and clientele identify as Jewish. And apparently, they also hate Goyim, meaning non-Jews. This is not speculation. It is said repeatedly in his emails, in which I will also link in the show notes. Many media outlets that falsely reported on Epstein include The Guardian, The Atlantic, CNN, amongst many, many others. Epstein clearly did not work alone. Many of the names I have mentioned, from Bill Gates to Leslie Groff, have not been prosecuted. This cannot stand. It is to the detriment of the victims and their loved ones, as well as society and justice, by letting these criminals walk free. This is far from over. Survivors of Epstein and his circle are being killed. Notable survivor Virginia Giuff did not commit suicide, and neither did Epstein. No amount of gaslighting will change that. With Pam Bondi refusing to release the rest of the files, and President Trump asking that people move on, tells me that much of Epstein's network is still operating. For those of you who are ready to combat human trafficking, there are ways to help. Rescue America is an anti-human trafficking nonprofit that I volunteered with on numerous occasions. You can apply to volunteer on their website, which I will also link in the show notes. Obviously, of course, there are financial donations to organizations like Rescue America, including Pearl at the Mailbox, FIRE, which stands for Freedom is for Everyone, Red Light Rebellion, Red Rover, the Tim Tebow Foundation, and others. I encourage each of you to look locally as well to nonprofits such as these. There may be opportunities to volunteer in your community, and that alone can impact lives. The worst thing we can do right now is to stay complacent. That is what Epstein's clientele and partners are betting on, including other pedophiles and human traffickers. You may notice that my voice has been shaky during this episode. My long hiatus was due to the many emotions I experienced reading the files. If it sounds like I am on the verge of tears, it is because I am. No one deserves to go through what anyone experienced at the hands of Epstein. And that is why we must keep fighting. Thank you for listening to today's episode. This was honestly a painful episode to produce, and that is why it has taken a few months to release. I ask that fellow Christians lift the victims and their loved ones in prayer for protection, healing, health, and justice. I look forward to better tidings in a future episode. Take care.